Hey yo, in this video we're going to talk about all things MIDI controllers. We're going to talk about how you can find the best MIDI controller for yourself, why I only use MIDI, and why MIDI and software instruments is the future. So if you're stoked, let's dive in. Hey yo, it's Alex from MIDI Music, and as always with this channel, it's my mission to help you, the artist, the musician, the producer, produce themselves by developing their mindset, expanding their creativity, and connecting to their inner artist in a deeper way. All right, so over the years, I have collected a fair amount of MIDI controllers. I've collected stuff like MIDI controllers for guitars. I've collected some MIDI keyboards, some wireless MPE crazy madness. I have this Akai MIDI controller, which synchronizes with Ableton, and my pièce de résistance, this Ableton Push 2, which is a godlike MIDI controller. So as you can see, I got a lot of MIDI controllers. All right, so number one, I want to talk about the main function as to why I use MIDI controllers and why you probably want to use MIDI controllers as well. And this is aside from the basic function that it was designed to do, which is basically MIDI controllers send musical performance data to software instruments inside your computer, and your computer generates the sound. So MIDI controllers don't actually create any sound, they just create performance data to trigger software. All right, but if we expand our perception of a MIDI controller from just being a keyboard that you can play a keyboard in your DAW, I actually see MIDI controllers as sources of inspiration. And that is the number one reason I use so many MIDI controllers, because their number one function is to inspire me, right? Is to get me creative, get me excited, get me playing with knobs and faders and interacting with the DAW in a more tactile way than just the mouse. All right, I definitely use this controller as my main controller because this controller is its own instrument in its own right? It's not like a guitar, it's not like a keyboard. The Push 2 is the Push 2. It's its own thing. And there's no one size fits all. Like, this is a pretty advanced controller. You might not need something so advanced right now. And it is designed for Ableton by Ableton. So this controller wouldn't be super useful with Logic or Pro Tools, right? So that's something to keep in mind, is that there's no one size fits all with MIDI controllers, but I guarantee that there's something out there that will help you get inspired and fit super well with your production workflow. All right, number two, as to why I use MIDI and why you should probably use MIDI as well, is that it enhances your expressiveness with the human touch. AKA, it allows you to play instruments into your DAW instead of relying on just clicking in notes and programming in performances. I come from a background of playing instruments, so guitar, bass, drums, before I got into production. So I came into production from the background of playing instruments. So to me, it felt very natural to find ways to expand the DAW so that you can actually play things into your DAW and get that tactile performance. And the reason for this is that you get something that you can't program, okay? You can't really program the human touch, and you can't really program what it feels like to play something, that flow state. And that state is where your best ideas will come from. That's when something authentic will express itself through you, and then you can edit it and change it later, but at least it started from there. And that's why I'm so passionate about having MIDI controllers attached to the DAW in various ways, because it allows you to expand the DAW, which I would say is like the instrument of the 21st century, into many different ways of interacting with it in a musical and creative way. And that will just open up your horizon so much versus if you're stuck penciling in notes. So I actually want to show you that real quick. I'll show you a quick example. All right, so I just want to give you a quick example of a huge difference of having a MIDI controller and mapping some parameters and getting your hands into the playing versus programming in notes. So I have this kind of simple patch that I've created. It's just a wavetable patch in Ableton that has kind of a lengthy note tail. So this is what it sounds like. Right? And if we were to try and program something, let me close this. You could double click here to create a MIDI clip. Right, we can pencil in notes. Maybe you want a kind of cool melody. Right, and kind of go like this and find notes that you like. kind of weird, right? So we came up with something that was pretty cool, but the difference is we could actually play that same thing. That kind of Lydian vibe. But while you're playing it, you can change the velocity, and we can actually go on the instrument, just as a quick example, right? And when you have an instrument, you can right click, you can group that instrument, and then it brings up all of these macro controls. And now if you have a push, if you have a MIDI controller that has knobs or something you can use to map to this, basically we could grab, let's say, the frequency, map it to macro 1. We could say, take the wavetable position up here, right? This position, and we could map this to macro 2, right? And now we're getting more hands-on control. We could even add on an effect, right? So we could put a delay on and we could throw it in the same group, right? So now these are connected. And now we can map this to macro 3. So now we have control of the filter, right? When I move this on my MIDI controller, get the filter control, the oscillator position, and then the dry wet of our delay. If I go over here, when I move this, we change the delay amount, right? And just those simple things while playing this, you can change this in real time. So we could have a quick attack where the note comes in right away, or it takes time for it to come in, slides in. So just having that tactile control, now we can play around with these things live, right? So have a fast attack, no delay, right? Maybe play with the filter. All right, so number 3, let's talk about how to actually find the best type of MIDI controller for you and your unique skills, your unique needs. And the way I see it, there's about 3 different types of MIDI controllers. There's MIDI controllers with pads, something like the Push 2. There's controllers that are like your MIDI keyboard. And there's control surface controllers, which the Push 2 is that as well. However, the APC40 has faders, it has knobs, and that can connect to your mixer. So that type of controller can really help you get hands-on control of your DAW without having to use your mouse to select a track and change the fader, change the send, change the panning. It's all at the tips of your fingers. All right, so one thing to think about is what type of skill sets do you already have? Do you already play piano? Are you already familiar with the layout of a keyboard? If so, then getting a MIDI keyboard, maybe with a few extra knobs and controls, might be a good fit for you. On the other side, if you're more of a percussionist or a guitarist, then something with pads might actually suit you better, because pads, you can play them percussively as if you're hitting a drum kit and trigger samples. You can even trigger notes. And if you have a controller with multiple pads, typically it will be tuned in fourths. So every row of pads will be separated by a fourth, which is very similar to what you see on a guitar or a bass guitar. So if you're already familiar with that, you already play guitar, you already play bass, then maybe the pad layout might be a better fit for you. Or you could try the opposite. So if you're familiar with the keyboard, maybe go ahead and get pads, and that will surely inspire you to see new ways to harmonize your tracks, create chords, and to interact with your DAW and instruments in new and exciting ways. And the reverse is true as well. If you're familiar with the guitar and bass, maybe grab yourself a keyboard MIDI controller, and you'll start to see new possibilities of harmony, chord progressions, riffs that you can come up with on the piano while you're used to playing in fourths like a bass or a guitar or something, right? And if you have no experience with an instrument or you're just getting started, I still encourage you to find a MIDI controller and maybe start off with an entry model MIDI controller that does a little bit of everything. So something like the MPK Mini is a great choice, because if you look at this controller, it's like maybe $100, but it has keys, it has some pads, it has some knobs, it has a little bit of everything, so you can actually have some fun, experiment, and see if there's a specific type of controller, whether it's the keyboards, maybe it's the pads, that you resonate with more, and then build from there to maybe a more advanced controller, or just stick with this one since this one covers all the bases. All right, so number 4, let's talk about why MIDI. Like, why am I going on about MIDI controllers? Why am I so passionate, obsessed about MIDI controllers and this type of workflow and what it has to offer? And I'll explain this in 3 steps. So number 1 is cost. Okay, so the cost of a MIDI controller, an entry model MIDI controller, like I just showed you, the MPK Mini, is like maybe $100. You can get really advanced MIDI controllers like the Push 2. They're more expensive. That's like $700-800. But there's also really nice keyboards that have realistic feel, that are super versatile, that you can get a super high quality one for like $300-400, somewhere in that range. If you compare that to hardware, right? If you compare that to a synthesizer like a Moog or a Roland synth, a Korg synth, you're looking at least $500-600 for a base model synthesizer, all the way up to thousands of dollars for hardware, right? So there's a huge price difference between getting hardware and getting a MIDI controller. All right, so number 2 is control, and MIDI controllers actually allow you to control your DAW in ways that a hardware synthesizer or a hardware groove box or whatever it may be might not actually provide for you. And simple stuff like the transport controls, so play, stop, start, navigating your DAW, right? Adjusting track volume, panning, sends and returns. You can even, on certain controllers, add devices, add tracks like the Push 2, which is amazing. And MIDI can actually control more than just the DAW. MIDI controllers could actually control lighting. It could control scene changes in OBS like this, like changing to different scenes. You can control that with MIDI. So the versatility and the control is second to none, versus hardware stuff is like, yes, some of them have MIDI out ports, but then you have to manually map everything, and it's not the intended use of that thing. And there's also some limitations that you'll face if you're trying to use a hardware device to send MIDI messages to your DAW. It might get a little bit crazy. All right, so number 3 is software, all right? And software will always be more expandable than hardware. So for example, if you purchase a MIDI controller, you have infinite amounts of options of synthesizers, groove boxes, control surfaces, plug-in navigation devices, sound libraries that you can attach to that MIDI controller and utilize it together. And that software will always be expanding and getting better and more powerful and more versatile, versus something that's more hardware. And hardware, yes, it can have its own unique sound, it can have its own unique thing. And if you have hardware you love, don't get rid of it, of course. However, it is limited to whatever it was programmed to do. And there's a big difference there, because if you get a MIDI controller, it's endlessly versatile, it's more controllable, you can edit the MIDI afterwards, you can edit the performance, you can control lights, you can control scene changes, and you can change the sound. You can use different plugins with one MIDI controller, versus hardware is like you're stuck with what's in the box, right? Although it can have some magic and limitations, can be very useful for creativity. If you're just looking at the future of where all this stuff is going, it's going to go towards software, right? Like software is getting more and more powerful, more and more versatile, and it's going to become easier and easier to get incredible sounding stuff just with a MIDI controller and some software. All right, and number 5 is just to give a quick think about how MIDI can enhance what you already have in terms of your unique strengths, what DAW you use, and what function it's going to serve. So for example, if you play an instrument, maybe think about how a MIDI controller can enhance the way that you play your instrument inside a DAW, right? Maybe you can use the MIDI controller to control effects on the audio that you're recording in through an instrument. Or if you don't play an instrument, maybe try to find a MIDI controller that will help you develop your skills to actually play instruments inside your DAW. And the more you can kind of find that thing that you can do, whether it's playing a MIDI controller or playing an instrument or mapping certain controls of your MIDI controller to specific effects that is your go-to, just to experiment and stuff, the more that you kind of use MIDI and these controllers as your thing, I definitely think that'll help you get a lot more engaged with the process of coming up with ideas, of becoming a better musician, a better artist, expressing yourself in new ways, experimenting in new ways, and something that's uniquely you that will separate you from everybody else who's just programming in notes and using MIDI packs and using samples. You'll be expressing yourself in a way that is uniquely you. So I encourage you to think about that when you're thinking about how you're going to incorporate MIDI into your thing. And one thing that's been super useful for me is to find MIDI controllers that actually allow me to control the DAW with my hands, instead of always relying on the mouse to go select a track, turn up the volume, change the panning, pencil in some automation. Although I still do all those things, I like having the hand-on tactile control because it just keeps you in flow state, right? Like instead of dropping your instrument or dropping what you're doing to get on the mouse, to select the track, to do whatever it is, add the effect, you can do all that stuff with your hands, right? So you're still in the moment, you're still moving around, you're engaged with the process. And even if you get the beginner MIDI controllers to just test the waters, most of those will have transport controls. So you can actually just use play, use pause, use record on your controller instead of always reaching for the mouse. And if you have a DAW like Ableton or something, everything is pretty much MIDI mappable. So you could just get like a stock MIDI controller that has a few knobs and a few faders or something, and you could map those to anything in your DAW, right? So that's super powerful if you think about it that way, and using MIDI controllers as a way to expand your DAW outside of the computer to have more hands-on control. And a final thing to keep in mind is that there are some controllers that are designed for specific software. So for example, the Push 2, the APC40 are both designed for Ableton, right? So it wouldn't make too much sense to use these with a different DAW. However, there are MIDI controllers that are Logic specific, Pro Tools specific. The Machina hardware from Native Instruments goes with their software as well, so they connect super well. So if you're looking for something that just has a massive amount of integration and automatically maps, so for example, in Ableton, if I select an instrument, if I select a track, everything about that track pops up on the screen and everything is automatically mapped to whatever I'm looking at in the software. And that two-way communication is just so powerful because you just select the track and then all of the options to change the sound, to add effects, to pencil in new notes and program new performances, whatever it may be, just automatically map themselves. And that kind of interface with your software is invaluable. All right, so if you're really thinking of getting MIDI into your studio to a whole other level and get that more hands-on control instead of always relying on linear decision making, clicking the mouse ones and zeros, and get more into a flow state, then I encourage you to look at specific hardware that was designed for specific software, because typically they'll be very well integrated and have that connectivity. And hey, if you're just getting started with music production and feeling completely overwhelmed by the process, or if you've been at this for a while and you're having trouble finishing projects, getting it to the finish line, or hey, if you just want to get a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created a super easy to follow 7-step framework that helps you go from your very first ideas to arranging them, to editing them, mixing and mastering. So getting your songs from the beginning to the end in a super easy to follow framework that you can print out. It's super handy to have around your studio. So if you're interested in grabbing that, you can grab it in the description below. And that wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up. If you want to stay in tune with the next MetaMind music transmission, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and let me know, do you use MIDI in your studio? Is it a huge part of what you do, or do you not use MIDI at all and only use mouse clicks? I'd love to know your experience with MIDI and what role it plays in your music making. And with that, I will end this video and we'll see you in the next one.